I hope to finish Coleridge's Biographia literaria portion that is there in your syllabus. So in the last class we discussed how Coleridge actually criticized Wordsworth's ideas about his themes of poetry, that what Wordsworth said that his themes of poetry should be, and about rustic language, theme, language and poetic diction. Now Coleridge criticized this, and today we will discuss what was or how Coleridge criticized Wordsworth's ideas about poetic diction. Now coming to the detailed consideration of Wordsworth's theory of diction, Coleridge actually takes up his argument, and he takes up a statement one by one and demonstrates that Wordsworth's views are not justified. Why? Because Wordsworth asserts that the language of poetry is a selection of the real language of man and the very language of man. So Wordsworth said what? That the selection of language, the language of the poetry is a selection of the real language of man and the very language of man. Now here the contradiction is very much within Wordsworth's own statement, because when I'm talking of the real and the very language of man, and at the same time I'm using the word selection, that means when I am selecting something, that means that I am rejecting many other things and selecting something out of the mass. That means that particular thing is more appropriate and goes with my requirements rather than those things which have been rejected. So selection is a political process. Selection means there is a sort of exercising of power with which I am selecting something which conforms to my requirements, or which actually meets my requirements, or which goes with what I am trying. The contradiction is there very much in Wordsworth's statement, a selection of the real language of man or the very language of man. And he says that Wordsworth moreover said that there is no essential difference between the language of prose and the language of poetry. So the two things that Wordsworth stated about poetic diction is that the language of poetry is a selection of the real language of man and the very language of man, number one. And two, he said that there is no essential difference between the language of prose and that of poetry. Now, how Coleridge contradicted Wordsworth's ideas on poetic diction? Coleridge contradicted with the very thing. He retorts that Coleridge retorted that every man's language varies according to the extent of his knowledge. So if my language will differ from another person in terms of the knowledge that I have and the knowledge that that particular person has. So knowledge makes a difference in our use of language. So he says that language varies according to the extent of his knowledge, the activities of his faculties. Suppose my language will be quite different from a philosopher's language whose faculty of thinking is much more enriched and much more active than that of mine, or a person who is a more thinking animal, who thinks very deeply and who can explore the things analytically. The use of his language will be quite different from that of mine, who is comparatively less explorative and less analytical in terms of thinking, etc. So Coleridge says that every man's language varies according to the extent of his knowledge, 1, the activities of his faculties, 2, and the depth and quickness of his feeling. So he pointed out 3 things, that 1, the language of a person varies according to 1, the extent of his or her knowledge, the activities of his faculties, and 3, the depth and quickness of thinking. One who is much more intellectually sound than me, one who is more intelligent than me, his or her language will be more enriched than that of mine. So there is no such thing as a specifically termed, packed, or ready-made common man's language. So there is no such thing as a common man's language ready-made in front of you. So this is the common man's language, the real and the very language of man, and I will take that and use that in my poetry. That is not possible, because Coleridge says that each and every person's language or use of language actually differs in terms of his or her knowledge, the activities of his faculties, and the depth and quickness of his feelings. So then he says that every man's language, the common man's language, they have 3 particular qualities or characteristics. First, the individual peculiarities. So my use of language, my choice of words will be a bit different from that of others, and it differs in terms of individuality. Every individual has his or her own distinctiveness in the use of language. That is the individual peculiarities. 2, so we have, for example, we have our own mannerisms, just like PSC sir sometimes says, is that okay, is that okay, is that okay. So this particular phrase, it is not something common to all English teachers teaching in university or college or school. It is specifically my use of the words. But if you just focus on, if you look into the very words that I'm using, is that okay, then a question mark. These particular words are very common, and every common man or a special slang these words, but the time of using my mode of expression and the emotion that I put into it, or the thought that is there behind my uttering this particular question, they actually differ from person to person. So this is the individual peculiarity. Second is properties common to the class to which he or she belongs. The second thing Coleridge points out, that there are about the 3 characteristics of common man's language. One is the individual peculiarity. Second is properties common to the class to which he belongs. Suppose I belong to a class where a class of teachers. So my selection of words will have some affinity with other members of my class. Suppose portion, suppose what is a portion, syllabus, then term papers, then internal activities, then co-curricular activities, then viva voce. So the people who belong to a specific class, they use certain words or phrases which characterize their class where they belong. Suppose a group of a person who belongs to the group of sales executives, they will be using certain words like market with a special sense, target, then sales report, turnovers. One who is associated with science will be using certain scientific terms. So these things, these particular words, a particular person or an individual acquires from the class where he or she belongs. And there are certain words and phrases which are of universal use. Certain words are there. Actually these distinctions you need to understand with certain acuteness, that a particular word or a phrase can be could have been an example of an individual peculiarity or an representative of a particular class or of universal significance. Universal use, certain words are there, the sun rises in the this is something very universal, or universities have PG courses, or English is a language. So all these words and this phrase, the sentences, they are of universal use, and they actually cut across all the class borders and individual differences. So Coleridge says that the two things. First, he retorted that language, every man's language varies according to what their extent of knowledge, to their activities of faculty, and 3 is the quickness and depth of his feeling. These are the points. And then he says that every man's language has 3 characteristics. 1 is the peculiar individual peculiarities, 2 is properties common to the class to which he or she belongs, and 3 words and phrases of universal use. Then Coleridge says what? Coleridge retorts with this. First, it's individual peculiarities and universal use. Then Coleridge, and I'm reading out from the line from Coleridge's Biographia Literaria. No two men of same class or of different classes speak alike. He says that because of the individual peculiarities. No two men will of same class or different class, they will speak alike, because the words will be the same, but the choice of words, the modes of expression, that will be quite different, although both use words and phrases common to them all. Because why? Because in the one case their natures are different. Why? Because a particular man having a specific feeling, or his nature is quite different, because we all are individuals in terms of our nature, our characters, because in one case their natures are different, and in the other their classes are different. One is they are individually, every individual is an individual with his or her own distinctiveness, and second is he or she belongs to a specific class which also has certain effect on the use of language of that person in different class. So he says this applies as much to the language of the rustics as to that of townsmen. Now Wordsworth says that he wants to take up the common man's language, those people who belong to who are rustic people. He wants to take up language, the common man's language, the common rustic people's language for his poetry. So he says that these differences you will find not only in the language of the townsmen, but also in the language of the rustic people. So this is a very common characteristic that you will find in terms of the differences that we find in the language of the individuals. So picking up the language of the rustic won't give you an ready-made universal something which is a common man's language. We can directly use it into poetry. In both cases, the language varies from person to person, class to class, and place to place. So every individual's language is different from each other, and they depend upon their individual peculiarities, depend upon the class where they belong, and 3, some words and phrases are there which are of universal use. And Coleridge says that this applies not to the language of the townsmen or townspeople, but this applies also to the language of the rustic people. So what Wordsworth said, that I want to pick up the language of the rustic people because that will fit properly into my poetry. Coleridge says that this is not possible, because there is no such ready-made common man's language that you will get in the speech of the rustic people. What the rustic people speak, there you won't get something ready-made common man's language. That was Coleridge's point. He says what? That their natures are different and their classes are different. So then the question is So what should be the language which is the real language of men? Then Coleridge says that when we are talking of, he first said that what Wordsworth has said about his choice of the language of the rustic people for as poetic diction, he says that what Wordsworth has thought, this is not true. Then the next question comes, then what should be the source of poetic diction according to Coleridge? So then he says, Coleridge asks, then which is the real language of men? He then poses the question, which is the, or what is the real language of men? And he himself replies that the common man's language has to be purged of its uncommon or accidental features. So he says that if you want to take up a language for as poetic diction, to use that in your poetry, and if you want to pick up the common man's language, you have to do certain selections, which Wordsworth has also said, but he actually overlooked that, or he actually did fail to do justice to the word selection. The Coleridge says the selection is that you have to purge off, you have to clean that language, and clean what? Purge off its uncommon or accidental features. So what is uncommon and accidental features? So it's uncommon features and accidental features which have been picked up from families, profession, or locality. So what I said, that a particular person uses a language because that person is not only just an individual person. So as an individual, he or she has his own characteristics. That is one thing. Apart from that individual characteristics of one's language, a particular person is not an individual isolated one. He is a part of the family. His family is a part of the society, or his family is a part of a class, or that particular person is a part of the class. So certain qualities or characteristics that person picks up from the class or the society or the family where he or she has been posited. So Coleridge says that to get the common man's language, which will be fit for poetic diction, you need to purge off all the qualities which one has added in his language from the family, the class, or the society, or the profession. Because if you don't purge it off, then that language will become what? That language will become an partially sided language. In that language, if I am using a language which is full of the terms used by teachers, or which is full of the term used by sales executives, that won't become a common man's language. That language which I will be using without purging off all these qualities, that poetic diction will have the qualities of the sales executive's language, or the qualities of a teacher's language, or the qualities of a doctor's language, or the qualities of the engineer's language. So if you can, Coleridge says that if you can purge off all those qualities which one has added to his language from family, profession, class, or locality, then that language becomes an ordinary language, which here Coleridge uses the word ordinary in the general sense of the term. He says that then only that language becomes the ordinary language of men. Now, when you are omitting the peculiarities that are there, or the peculiarities the language has acquired from the speaker's class, family, or locality, or something, that what happens when you purge off all those peculiarities from that language becomes a common language. He says what? That language becomes a common language. So he says that omission and changes are necessary, which can be termed with the thing selection. When I am selecting the language, that means I am doing certain, or that language is undergoing certain processes. I'm omitting, I'm changing, I'm modifying that language of the rustics to make it transferable to any species of poem. So when I'm omitting, changing, modifying the language, then what happens, that language becomes fit to be used to any species of poem. But Coleridge says that the exception lies in the case of drama. Why? Because in drama, what happens, sometimes we need to project certain characters. Now when I'm projecting a character on stage, that character requires a specific social, cultural, political or economic background, because there in drama the projection of the character becomes very important. What the character speaks, what the character acts, or how the character acts, all these things become important. So he says that the exception lies only with drama, because in drama if you use a common language, that will go against the proper projection of the character on stage. Then Coleridge says that, now coming back to the language of poetry, he says that when the language, common man's language, is purged of all its peculiarities, then it becomes a really common man's language which is fit for using as poetic diction. So he says that that language has a sort of universal appeal, and therefore it becomes the language of poetry. So he says that therefore it becomes the language of poetry. Language so generalized, he says what? Therefore a language which is generalized, so it becomes generalized because it becomes generalized. Why? Because it has been purged of all its peculiarities. So a language so generalized, so selected. It says how it has been made a general language? By selecting something out of the mass, out of the given thing. So by selecting, by changing, by modifying, by omitting, in general by editing that language. And that means when I'm doing the selection process, I'm doing what? I'm purifying the language. So when I'm purifying the language, that means I am doing bringing certain changes in the language that was given. So the language becomes also purified. Purified of what? Purified of all that is gross and vulgar. I don't want to bring in the ideas that in very general, in the general context, that what happens in the present time when we use certain vulgar or gross language or words in our creative productions. But actually Coleridge and his contemporaries were not aware of this particular ideology or this particular discourse when they were writing Biographia Literaria. So they still believe that the language of the poetry should be purified language, purified of what? Of all that is gross and vulgar, and it will differ in no way from the language of any other man of common sense. And then he says that actually what Coleridge wants to point out is that language of the common man may be like a glass of water, drinking water. Now to make it more drinkable, what you can do? You can do what? You can purify the language. You can purify, just the way you can purify the glass of water. So certain processes of osmosis, reverse osmosis, or you can make it a distilled water, and so many things you can do. So actually the poet needs to do this distillation or purification to make the common man's language fit for poetry. And then when the purified language comes up, or when you get the purified language, it becomes a common language which can be shared by all people of common sense, and which is also fit for writing poetry. So that was what Coleridge wanted to say about Wordsworth's use of language. Now, second, Wordsworth's contention was what? So Wordsworth's contention that there is no essential difference between the language of poetry and that of prose. He suggests that there is no essential difference between the language of poetry and language of prose. And Wordsworth had the idea when we were talking of when we were discussing Coleridge's idea on fancy and imagination, and what Coleridge said about his own ideas of poetry and how he differs from Wordsworth. In our previous classes, I said that Wordsworth said that if you add meter to the language of the poet, of the prose, it becomes poetry. So some meter is something super added to poetry, and Coleridge there actually objected to Wordsworth's ideas and says that so meter and rhyme, they are not super added, or they are not just extraneous thing to poetry, but they are they form a sort of organic unity. The form and content should be organically and logically connected with each other, which only gives the reader the real pleasure. Okay. Now Wordsworth says that there is no essential difference between the language of prose and that of poetry. Now Coleridge, what is Coleridge's reply? That there is and there ought to be an essential difference between the language of prose and that of poetry. He says that there should be a difference between the language of prose and the language of poetry, and then he enumerates a statement. He says that the language of poetry differs from that of prose in the same way in which the language of prose differs from the language of prose actually differs from the language of conversation. Suppose I am writing a prose, I am using the same language. Suppose I'm writing a prose in English. I'm using the same word. I'm following the same grammatical rules. I'm following the same sentence construction and everything. But in the same language, when I'm conversing, that becomes different. The language of prose and the language of conversation, they have the difference. Just like the language of speaking and the language that I'm speaking in English, the language is different from I'm reading. So in each case, just like conversing, writing and reading, we are using the same English language, but the language differs. Why? Because our mode of expressions are different. If I take the class, when I'm conversing with you, when I'm talking to you, if I speak just like I'm reading out something, just merely reading, not just only taking the cues from a book, I'm just reading the text and this and this and this and this and this and this and this. So if I do that, that becomes less interesting. And why it becomes less interesting? Because it fails to make the proper communication. So though in conversing, reading and writing, the language is English, in each and every case the language is different in terms of the modes of expression, in terms of the arrangements of the words, in terms of the construction. So all these things Coleridge brings in. Coleridge gives a number of reasons here in support of his view. First, he says the first reason, language is both a matter of words and the arrangement of those words. Language is what? Primarily it deals with words and arrangements of words. That means we need the help of grammar and the rules of grammar for arranging those words, for constructing the sentence. Now will you mind if I take a 2-minute break? 2 minutes break, okay.